Chapter 9. A Crown Too Hot for a Dragon. Danny was no stranger to backstabbing, betrayal, deceit, or manipulation. They weren't anomalies in his life. They were recurring mechanics, patterns that arrived, played their part, and removed themselves when they finished teaching whatever lesson they were designed to deliver. But he understood that not every piece on the chessboard was meant to stay. Some only existed to force a move, others to reveal the board itself. It was always the pieces that remained that mattered. The monkey with the Zodiac was one of the first. He tried to disrupt the foundations before the kingdom had even raised a flag. He thought he was undermining something fragile, exposing weakness, pulling threads before they could be tied. What he actually did was far more useful. He failed, and in failing he laid down the blueprint. The system learned where it could be attacked. The dragon learned where to reinforce. Nothing collapsed the structure. He just showed it where the load-bearing walls needed to be thicker. Then there were the fools, horse rooster and dragon ox. They didn't try to test the foundations. They tried to destroy the kingdom from the inside out. Subtlety first, then friction, then noise. If the monkey was a lesson in systems, the fools were a lesson in proximity. They didn't come with siege weapons. They came with smiles, access, and entitlement. And when that failed, they left behind more unlit gunpowder. The plot never went off. The fuse was never ignited. But the kegs remained, proof that the threat hadn't been imaginary, only mistimed. That kind of danger doesn't disappear when the people leave. It lingers. It changes how a dragon sleeps, how he watches, how he governs. Danny wasn't naive anymore. He knew the crown had heat. He knew power attracts hands that don't want to build, only to hold, twist, or burn. And he knew that every betrayal that arrived wasn't there to end the story, but to refine it. Because this is the truth dragons eventually learn the hard way. A crown doesn't crush you when you put it on. It burns you slowly. And only those built to endure heat get to decide whether they wear it or let it melt everything around them. Waywood would emerge from lockdown at the same time the rest of the world did. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but cautiously, like something stretching stiff limbs after being held too long in one position. The wider world was recalibrating after the pandemic, renegotiating norms, relearning proximity, pretending normality was just a switch you could flip back on. But Waywood went into a different lockdown, its own version, contained, pressurized, quiet in ways that weren't peaceful. The gates didn't close out of fear. They closed out of necessity. Too much movement, too many variables, too much unresolved tension sitting too close to the core. Lockdown didn't weaken the kingdom, it compressed it. And by the time the pressure eased, something inside Danny had already made a decision. The Crimson Courtyard had spoken, not loudly, not emotionally, but definitively the priority had shifted. No longer comfort, no longer ignorance, no longer pretending the crown didn't change the weight of the head that wore it. Preservation over ease, clarity over denial. This wasn't about paranoia, it was about pattern recognition. The core had reviewed the evidence. Betrayals survived, threats neutralized, structures tested, and reached the same conclusion dragons always do when they've endured long enough. Peace is temporary. Readiness is permanent. So while the external world exhaled, Danny inhaled. The pressure building now wasn't coming from councils, neighbors, or enemies at the gate. It was coming from inside. From the dragon who knew exactly what wearing the crown meant. He wasn't stepping into rest. He was stepping back onto the front line. Again, not because he wanted conflict, but because leadership doesn't get to choose when reality calls. The crown hadn't softened him, it had sharpened his awareness, and somewhere between quarantine and release, between isolation and reopening, the dragon understood the truth most kings learn too late. You don't stop being battle ready when you win. You become responsible for what happens when the next battle arrives. And this time, it wouldn't come from outside the walls. It would come from within. Those who wanted to sabotage Waywood for all the noise they made were never the real threat. Their part to play was closer to marionettes and children's toys. Props arranged to look dangerous, positioned to feel serious, moved just enough to draw the eye. They rattled. They postured. They tried to loom. But in truth, their reach was short and their weight was light. Their significance wasn't in what they could do, or even what they had done. It's how they validated the pattern to Danny and Danny's system that even if it's your kingdom, someone will want to take it from him. And to an individual observer, someone bound to linear timelines, personal bias, black and white causality, it would be easy to misread the situation entirely. Easy to point at the ashes and say, there, that's the disruption. Easy to simplify a complex collapse into a single convenient villain. You could even blame the domestics. Maud and T and their arguments spilling into the streets of Waywood. Friction in relationships, restlessness, jealousy. The kind of everyday human tension that looks mundane but feels explosive when it's lived up close. You could argue it was the pressure of raising a son, the baby prince, inside an environment that was never meant to be gentle, that it was too much responsibility, too fast, layered onto a parent's already carrying too much weight. You could say it was Danny's ego finally being checked, that his ambition outpaced his wisdom, that arrogance or ignorance had finally caught up with him, that the dragon flew too close to something he couldn't control and got burned. All of those explanations would sound reasonable. They would even be partially true. And that's why they're dangerous, because the real mechanism at work wasn't loud enough to be blamed. The truth was simpler and far more deliberate. What was coming had to be constructed seductively. If it had arrived as force, Danny would have met it head on. If it had come as open conflict, Spike would have woken. If it had presented itself as an enemy, the crown would have hardened, the gates would have closed, and the lesson would have bounced off armor already forged. But that wasn't the lesson. This wasn't about crushing a dragon. It was about guiding him to step forward willingly. The collapse had to look accidental. The destabilization had to feel personal. The dismantling had to masquerade as choice. Only then would Danny's role remain intact. Only then would the transformation carry meaning. Only then would the dragon move himself into the position Karma needed him to occupy next. Anything louder would have made him irrelevant. And Karma doesn't waste dragons. It teaches them, quietly, precisely, until they finally understand what the crown was really for. Eventually, Danny was met with the choice again. He'd been here before. That was the sickening clarity of it, not unfamiliar pain. Recognized pattern. Snake versus snake. Two different snakes. Two different worldviews. Different instincts. Different survival strategies. Different truths. And yet structurally the same archetypes circling the same dragon. Opposites but aligned. Almost fitting. Almost right. Almost convincing. And the configuration was familiar too. Three of them again in something unconventional, unstable, impossible to hold long term. He'd already lived this once, and it had taught him that lesson the hard way. This was not new territory, just a sharper version of it. This time, something finally landed. Danny was beginning to understand that his relationships could not mirror his mind. Inside his head, multiplicity worked. Courts, councils, voices, contradictions. The dragon could hold many truths at once internally. He could debate, split, rotate, integrate. But a relationship could not do that. A relationship needed one moon, one lunar ghost, one echo that answered back in the same frequency. Not two, not a spectrum, not a rotating council. One. And in that realization, the structure cracked. He didn't choose either snake. They chose for him, and both disappeared. Chaos had finished its work. Once chaos had done what it came to do, it doesn't linger. It leaves you standing in the wreckage wondering how everything shifted so fast without ever announcing itself. Danny was left in the eye of it, the storm still raging, the pressure still real, the crown still hot, the kingdom still standing, but suddenly, painfully, quiet. She wasn't a rescue, not a savior, not romance. Autumn, rat horse, there in the eye of the storm. No speeches, no analysis, no spiritual framing, just hands on shoulders, dust brushed off, posture corrected, horse energy at its purest, endurance, forward motion, pragmatism without cruelty. Get up, breathe. You're not finished. Try again. You've got this. But this wasn't just horse. This was rat horse. The rat sees the maze. The horse runs the distance. Where the horse pushes forward instinctively, the rat knows where to push and when. Its strategy wrapped in stamina, survival intelligence paired with momentum. Not loud, not flashy, just effective. That's why she was there then. Not to soothe the dragon, not to challenge the crown, but to quietly realign trajectory. Rat horse doesn't sit in chaos admiring it. It recalibrates and moves on. Not consolation, direction. And that's the thing Danny finally understood in that moment. Snakes catalyze transformation. Dragons endure it. But rat horses are the ones who pull you back onto the road when the storm has stripped everything else away. The chaos hadn't won. It had simply cleared the board, and the dragon was still standing. As patents, the separated king and queen had no choice but to stay in contact. They were bound now by a constant thread. The little prince, a line that could not be cut without tearing something vital in both of them. But the woodland had lost its pull. The kingdom was still there, intact in structure and memory, but the king was not. A throne without a body is just wood and idea. Danny didn't collapse. He didn't mourn theatrically. He did what he always did when something ended before it made sense. He moved. He turned toward a new project, a caravan parked on Autumn's Drive. Smaller, quieter, mobile, contained, a place with edges again. No court, no banners, no witnesses, just enough space to breathe, to think, to exist without being interpreted. It looked like retreat. It wasn't. It was compression. The dragon folding its wings not in defeat but to pass through a narrow place without tearing itself apart. After kingdoms, chaos, crowns, and wars, the nervous system needed scale reduction. Fewer variables, fewer eyes, fewer projections. And still, even here, there was illusion. Because the caravan wasn't freedom. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't peace. It was a holding pattern. Another provisional structure, another temporary ground, another way of standing still while convincing himself he was moving forward. Another illusion. But illusions, too, serve a purpose. They buy time, and time, for a dragon who hasn't finished transforming yet, is sometimes the most dangerous gift of all. Money had always been a necessity. Never the goal, but never optional either. Even now, even after crowns and collapses and caravans, it still mattered. Bills don't disappear just because a man is fighting battles. And support still came in, quiet backing from those who had believed in the kingdom, who still believed in him, even if the banners were folded and the gates stood unattended. But Danny didn't live on belief alone. For the last few years, he'd been working on a small holding for a woman everyone knew as Ponderosa Sue, named after her farm. Danny being Danny called her Poultry Sue, not out of disrespect, out of accuracy. Chickens everywhere, ducks, geese, a chaos of feathers and routine. Alongside them, a couple of goats with opinions of their own, and one steady horse that had seen enough humans to know when to keep its distance. It wasn't glamorous. That was the point. The small holding was earth, literal, physical, grounding earth. Mud on boots, speed schedules, fences that needed fixing whether you felt like it or not. Life reduced to needs, cycles, seasons. Where the dragon had spent years bouncing around the sky, ideas, systems, leadership, symbolism. This place pulled him downward, into his hands, into his breath, into his body. No crown followed him there. No projections, no politics. Poultry Sue didn't care who you were yesterday. Goats don't listen to ideology. The horse didn't bow. The land didn't argue. It was an escape, yes, but not from responsibility. An escape from abstraction. And for a dragon who had spent too long living at altitude, sometimes the most healing thing wasn't ascent or conquest. It was dirt. Real dirt. The kind that reminds you that before you were anything else, king, leader, symbol, problem, you were still just a man standing on ground that didn't need you to explain yourself. She was a boar like Danny's granddad. Boar energy assaulted the earth by default. Honest, unshowy, consistent, without trying to be impressive. The kind of person who doesn't talk about values because they live them quietly every single day. No manipulation, no theater, no hidden angles. Just work, routine, care, continuity. Ponderosa Sue, Poultry Sue, was exactly that. She didn't ask Danny who he was before. She didn't care what he built, lost, ruled, or burned. She cared whether the birds were fed, whether the fence held, whether the goats were healthy, whether the horse was settled. Same question, same cadence, day after day. That steadiness echoed something ancient in him. Not the dragon, not the king, not the warrior. The lineage. The boar doesn't rush transformation. It outlasts it. It survives by staying rooted while storms exhaust themselves overhead. That's what his granddad had been. That's what this land was offering again. A reminder that endurance doesn't need an audience. Sue didn't fluctuate, didn't disappear. She was there yesterday. She'd be there tomorrow. And in a life that had been defined by cycles of ignition and collapse, losing more in one lifetime than most ever would and never having found home, That kind of reliability was medicine. Not exciting, not romantic, but profoundly stabilizing. The dragon still flew, the mine still burned, the past still hummed. But here, with the poultry, the goats, the horse, and a boar who simply kept showing up, there was something uninterrupted, consistency. And sometimes that's what keeps a dragon alive long enough to decide, caught what comes next. What followed was both a spiral and an elevation, somehow occurring at the same time. Danny showed up for the kids, always, no matter what was breaking, shifting, or dissolving elsewhere. That line never snapped. Fatherhood wasn't negotiable. It wasn't symbolic. It was action, presence, repetition. Autumn remained present, not intrusive, not clinging, just there, steady, rat horse consistency holding space without trying to own it. A witness, not a solution. Maud and T had already moved on. Their paths carried them elsewhere, as paths do when a chapter has said what it needed to say. And finally, the dog moved on too, quietly, no rupture, just distance forming. And the woodland fell silent, not dead, not destroyed, just still. The kingdom of Wayward didn't collapse, it went quiet, like a fire banked rather than extinguished. Structures remained, memory remained, meaning remained, but the voices that once filled it were gone, and without voices, even a kingdom listens to itself. The king was elsewhere, the villagers dispersed, the banners folded inward. The kingdom was now silent, though not gone. And silence for a dragon is never empty, it's where the next transformation waits. And then it came. The wyvern, the dragon elder, stirred the waters again and arranged another pagan gathering. Not a repeat, not a revival, the first of its kind, something quieter, older, more deliberate. Danny didn't rush toward it. The kingdom was silent now, and silence makes dragons cautious. But Cat, snake dragon, Capricorn, saw the timing clearly. She didn't push, she didn't persuade loudly, she simply made case calmly, intelligently, at exactly the right moment. So Danny went, and that's where he met Tommy, another dragon, but not mirrored, rather the opposite, a dragon dog. That combination matters. Dragon fire tempered by dog loyalty, strength within anchor used power that doesn't drift. Tommy wasn't loud. He didn't posture. He didn't orbit. He stood. And dragons recognize each other instantly when there's no competition in the air. That meeting would matter later. Not yet, but later. At the same time, Ellen was misplaced. Not lost, not gone, just out of alignment. Caught in misunderstanding, crossed wires, words that didn't land where they were meant to. Snake dragon energy doesn't disappear when that happens. It coils and waits. Her absence wasn't an ending, it was a pause with consequences still loading. And then something quieter happened. His little bird reached out, not dramatically, not romantically, not symbolically, just presence, time, proximity. Danny drove her to see her boyfriend. Long roads, long conversations that didn't need to be steered, and somewhere in those miles, they began to connect again. Monkey and dragon. Not tension, not pursuit, just rhythm. The monkey didn't ask for the crown, didn't challenge the fire. She moved around it naturally, cooling where needed, laughing where possible, understanding timing without explanation. And Danny felt it, that familiar mental ease, the kind that doesn't demand resolution. At the same time, threads from an older life reknit themselves. Danny reconnected with his little sister and with her children. Blood remembering blood, family without conditions. A reminder that before kingdoms, before crowns, before chaos, there was still lineage, still people who knew him before any of this and didn't need it explained. Nothing announced itself as the next chapter. No trumpets, no signs, just multiple lines quietly converging. The silence after Waywood wasn't emptiness, it was space. And space, when karma's involved, is where the next structure begins to form. Danny then met Annie, a sheepdog, and this mattered in a way that wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. She was in her own grief when they crossed paths. Not performative grief, not chaos, the quiet kind, the kind that changes how you move through rooms and measure your words. Sheepdog grief is particular. It doesn't collapse inward, and it doesn't lash outward. It keeps functioning while carrying weight that never fully sets down. That's where the lesson was, because dragons are used to generosity that comes with expectation. Even when they don't ask for it consciously, gravity creates obligation. They handle grief loudly. A sheepdog doesn't. She offered something else entirely. Unconditional support without agenda. Presence without claim. No crown, no throne, no role to play. Just a real influence. She didn't want Danny to lead her, didn't want to be led, didn't want to be rescued. She simply stood beside him while carrying her own load, while he stood with his own. For a dragon, that's disarming. Dragon psychology is built around holding responsibility, holding people together, holding systems upright, holding more than their fair share. But sheepdog energy doesn't need to be held. It holds itself quietly, faithfully, even when it's hurting. She taught Danny something subtle but crucial: how to stand without a crown, how to offer care without control, how to exist alongside someone's grief without trying to organize it, when to burn down the world, and when to let go of the ashes. Their time together was brief, but brief doesn't mean small. Sheepdogs enter a dragon's life not to stay, but to recalibrate the dragon's understanding of service. When she moved on, there was no rupture, just understanding. And that's how you know a lesson landed, because dragons don't forget the ones who showed them how to be human when no one was watching. And Annie and Danny remained close regardless. Sue then died, and with her went something quietly foundational. No drama, no collapse. Not on the outside. Not really. By now his understanding of grief was more complex. It was a sudden absence of a bore constant. The salt of the earth presence that had held one corner of Danny's life steady without ever announcing itself. Boar energy doesn't prepare you for loss. It assumes continuity. When it's gone, the gap is stark, almost confusing. The routine breaks. The land feels different. The weight returns. Around the same time, Danny got a new car. On paper, that sounds like progress, independence, mobility, agency, and in practical terms, it was all of that. But symbolically, it marked a shift from being held in place by environment to being able to move again. Movement is dangerous for dragons, especially dragons who've just lost a grounding force, because motion wakes instinct, and instinct is where old patterns live. That's when Lai and Danny tried again. Not naively, not blindly, but pulled together by something unfinished that neither of them could quite silence. Snake and dragon have a way of circling back, not out of nostalgia, but out of unresolved karmic tension. There's always a sense that something wasn't completed properly, that one more pass might settle it. From the outside, it could look like hope. From the inside, it felt like inevitability. Snake dog energy seeks security through connection. Dragon seeks coherence through intensity. Together, they generate a powerful illusion of stability. Passionate, purposeful, convincing. It feels like alignment when it's really suspension. And suspension can't last, because this wasn't real stability returning. It was the end of false stability. The car gave Danny motion. Sue's death removed an anchor. The snake returned when the dragon was already in flux. That combination doesn't settle chaos. It reignites it. And beneath the surface, the Zodiac dynamics were already grinding. The snake sensed vulnerability. The dragon sensed unfinished business. Neither were wrong, but neither were aligned with what came next. This wasn't a fresh beginning. It was the last echo of an old one. And as every dragon eventually learns, when you step back into chaos thinking you're choosing differently, you're usually being invited to see why the pattern must finally break.